All right, let's dive right in. Today we're taking a look at the final stages of World War I, particularly that crucial year, 1918, when America, really became a major player. And Germany, well, their grip on the war started to slip. We've got some incredible sources to dig through for this one. First-hand accounts, military dispatches, even some pretty intense political maneuvering.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to sort of peel back the layers and uncover the personalities, the different agendas that kind of came to a head in that final act of the war. It wasn't just about like battles and tactics, right? They were essentially trying to figure out a whole new world order, and the choices they made back then, well, they have repercussions for it, like generations.
I'm already hooked. But to kind of set the stage for everyone, it's August 1918, and General Pershing, the guy in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, he's finally ready to unleash the American First Army. He'd been planning this major offensive, and I have a feeling it was about more than just pushing back the German lines. What do you think?
You're definitely picking up on something important there.
Yeah.
Pershing, he was ambitious. He wanted to prove that America wasn't just like a supporting actor in this whole thing. He wanted to show the world, maybe even the Allies themselves, that the U.S. Army was a force to be reckoned with.
So he wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of just merging his troops into the larger Allied command structure, was he?
Not one bit. There was some definite tension between Pershing and the Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch. Foch, he wanted this massive coordinated attack. He saw Pershing's forces as like a key piece of that puzzle. But Pershing, he insisted the U.S. operate independently. They'd entered the war as a separate entity.
Right, so we've got this clash of personalities, clash of strategies. What happened? Did they just, butt heads until someone gave in?
Well, they eventually reached a compromise. Pershing, he agreed to participate in the larger Allied offensive. But he insisted on leading his troops in a separate operation, and that's what led to the U.S. First Army's first major engagement, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel.
Okay, help me visualize this. We're talking over 200,000 American troops, plus some French forces, launching this attack on a heavily fortified German position. This wasn't just any battle, was it?
Absolutely not. It was a major turning point in the war. And not just because it was a significant victory for the U.S. It really signaled this major shift in the global balance of power. Europe wasn't the only one calling the shots anymore. America had arrived on the scene, and their influence was only going to grow from that point forward.
That's a really interesting point. So Pershing gets his victory, America flexes its muscles on the world stage, the Allies are one step closer to winning. But what about the Germans? How are they taking all of this?
Well, this is where you start to see things unravel for Germany, both physically and psychologically. The Allied counteroffensives were relentless, and the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, that was a devastating blow. The Hindenburg Line, it was like Germany's last stand, their final line of defense. When it crumbled, it was like their whole war effort was caving in.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the despair they must have felt. You mentioned earlier that we have some firsthand accounts, and, some of those sources describe German officers weeping openly, the Kaiser frantically trying to salvage the situation. It sounds like utter chaos.
It really was a complete psychological collapse. Their confidence was shattered, their belief in victory gone. One of their top military strategists, Ludendorff, he basically admitted defeat. It was over.
So knowing they were losing, the Germans scrambled to find a way out, right? They appointed Prince Max as chancellor, hoping he could negotiate some kind of decent peace agreement with the Allies, especially with President Wilson.
And that's where Wilson's famous 14 points come in. They were his vision for a post-war world. Open diplomacy, free trade, and the big one, creation of a League of Nations to, prevent future wars.
But I'm sure the Allies weren't all on board with Wilson's kind of idealistic vision, right? I mean, they had just fought a brutal war. Everyone had their own ideas about how things should be settled.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Clemenceau of France, he wanted revenge. He'd lived through 2 German invasions, and he demanded harsh reparations, complete disarmament of Germany. Lloyd George of Britain, he was a little more pragmatic, trying to find a balance, punish Germany but not push them so far that they'd completely collapse. It was this powder keg of personalities and agendas.
Wow, so even with the fighting dying down, it sounds like there was another war brewing, a war of ideas, a war to shape the peace. Did they even have a chance of coming to an agreement with all those competing demands and personalities?
Well, it was a grueling process, for sure, full of clashes and compromises. Wilson, he had to give up on a lot of his more idealistic points, And some of the decisions they made in those negotiations had pretty devastating consequences in the years to come, especially for Italy. But that's a story for another time.
This is all so fascinating, but I can't help but think about the soldiers on the front lines while all this is happening. The war might be winding down, but they're still out there in the trenches, facing the enemy.
You're right to bring that up because there's this heartbreaking story that really highlights the human cost of war, even in those final hours. Imagine this. The armistice is just hours away, but American soldiers are still being killed and wounded fighting a war that's essentially already over.
Wait, you're telling me that even on Armistice Day there were soldiers dying? I need to hear more about this.
Well, there was this U.S. major leading his Marines in a desperate river crossing. He had orders to take out German machine gun nests, and he had no idea that peace was about to be declared.
It's just, it's hard to think about those Marines, charging into battle when they had no idea the war was about to end.
Yeah. And it's even more tragic when you realize there were no clear instructions from headquarters about, what to do in those final hours. The major felt he had no choice but to follow orders, even though he was sending his men into almost certain death.
It really speaks to their courage and their sense of duty. But it also just exposes the brutal reality of war, right? Sometimes victory comes at a terrible price.
Absolutely. And when you look at the total casualties of World War I mean, it's estimated that 40 million people were killed or wounded. It really puts this story into perspective, a much larger and somber perspective.
It's hard to even wrap your head around those numbers. The immense suffering, I mean, both physical and psychological, that lingered long after the guns fell silent.
Exactly. The war left deep scars, on individuals, families, entire nations, a legacy that continued to shape the world for generations.
So finally, at 11:00 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice went into effect, and the Great War was officially over.
Can you imagine the wave of emotions just washing over people across the globe? Relief, joy, grief, disbelief. I mean, it must have been overwhelming.
So while soldiers were still dying in those final hours, Wilson was already being hailed as this peacemaker back home. He returned to Washington, determined to see his vision of a lasting peace through the League of Nations realized. But as we'll see, that peace wasn't going to be easily won.
He had a real fight ahead of him back home, especially from the Republicans. They controlled the Senate after the midterm elections.
And leading the charge against Wilson was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, they had a long and bitter rivalry, and Lodge was deeply suspicious of this whole League of Nations idea.
Now, what's interesting here is that Lodge's opposition, it wasn't just about isolationism like many believe. He actually believed in international engagement. But he saw the League as a potential threat to U.S. sovereignty.
You're talking about Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles, right?
Yeah.
The one that obligated member nations to defend each other's territory.
That's the one. Article 10 was very controversial. Basically, it said if one member of the League was attacked, all the others had to come to its defense. And Lodge argued that this could drag the U.S. into wars it didn't want, limiting its freedom of action, potentially violating the Constitution.
So Wilson's back from Europe. He's hailed as a hero, but he walks right into a political firestorm.
Exactly. And he found himself in this battle for the soul of America's role in the world, trying to rally support for the treaty and the League. And, well, Lodge was just as determined to dismantle his vision.
So what did Wilson do? I mean, he wasn't the kind of guy to just sit back and let Lodge win.
No, you're right about that. Wilson, in a move that would prove disastrous, decided to take his case directly to the American people. He embarked on this grueling cross-country speaking tour, hoping to drum up public support, put pressure on the Senate to ratify the treaty.
Sounds exhausting. Was he even up to it physically?
He wasn't. I mean, he was 62 years old at the time, and all the travel, the speeches, it really wore him down. There are accounts of him suffering these excruciating headaches, fatigue. There were even times he was incoherent during his speeches. He was pushing himself to the breaking point.
It's kind of tragic when you think about it. 1 minute you're at the peak of your power, and the next, well, it's a reminder of how fragile life can be.
And just days after he returned to Washington, Wilson suffered a massive stroke, left him partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly.
Oh, wow. What a devastating blow. And not just for Wilson personally, but for his vision of a lasting peace.
Yeah, it was a real turning point. The man who had championed the League of Nations was suddenly incapacitated, unable to fight for its realization. And to make matters worse, his wife, Edith Wilson, she essentially took over many of his presidential duties, shielding him from the public, controlling access to him.
So the treaty and the League were essentially adrift, their captain incapacitated, and the first mate calling the shots. So what happened next?
Well, the Senate debated the Treaty of Versailles, with Lodge leading the opposition. Despite Wilson's pleas for its ratification, the Senate rejected it, not once, but twice.
A crushing defeat for Wilson and a major turning point for America.
It was. The U.S., despite being a key player in the war, the architect of the peace treaty, would ultimately remain outside of the League of Nations.
So while the U.S. stayed out of the League, the war's impact was already reshaping the nation in many ways, right? I mean, think about it. Women finally won the right to vote.
Absolutely. The war acted as a catalyst. Women had proven their worth on the home front, and they demanded their right to vote. And African Americans, seeking better lives, they migrated north in huge numbers. It reshaped the very fabric of American society.
And it's fascinating how these global events ripple outward, impacting everything: politics, economics, social structures, even individual lives. But what about the bigger question? Did the U.S.'s rejection of the League of Nations contribute to the outbreak of World War II? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, did America's absence from the League of Nations really help pave the way for another world war?
It's tough to say for sure, but it definitely made the League weaker, without the U.S., politically and economically.
Right. So without that strong international body to enforce collective security and mediate disputes, countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, they were basically free to pursue their own, more aggressive policies.
Imagine trying to create a peace treaty after a war that brutal, that satisfies everyone. It's impossible, right? Well, that was the challenge they faced with the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was humiliated, crippled economically, and it basically created this breeding ground for extremist ideologies like Nazism to take root.
Right. And the Nazis exploited that resentment, promising to restore Germany to its former glory and, overturn all the perceived injustices of the treaty.
Exactly. And without a strong international coalition to oppose them, well, they were able to rearm, expand their territory, and eventually, plunge the world into another devastating conflict.
So in a sense, the seeds of World War II were sown in the aftermath of World War I, and the U.S. decision to stay out of the League of Nations, it played a significant role.
It's a sobering thought for sure. A reminder that even the best intentions, the most carefully crafted plans for peace, they can unravel when you're dealing with political realities and the unpredictable currents of history.
Yeah, and it really underscores the need for international cooperation, a unified response to aggression, threats to global security, lessons that unfortunately had to be learned the hard way.
And while the U.S. was turning inward, the war's impact, it was deeply felt domestically. It actually accelerated some pretty significant social change.
You're right. It led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, finally granting women the right to vote. A huge victory for the suffrage movement.
Absolutely. And we saw these massive demographic shifts as African Americans left the South, in droves, seeking better opportunities in the industrial North. It reshaped the very fabric of American society.
The war also ushered in a period of, economic prosperity for the U.S. It became this leading industrial power, supplying goods and materials to a war-torn Europe.
But this economic boom was built on a shaky foundation. The war had created this massive debt bubble, and the global financial system was incredibly vulnerable.
Which ultimately led to the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression. Another stark reminder of how interconnected the world really is and the lasting consequences of conflict.
It's fascinating how these seemingly disparate threads, war, peace, politics, economics, social change, are all interwoven into the tapestry of history,
It really highlights that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's this complex, dynamic process shaped by human choices, ambitions, and, unforeseen forces.
And understanding that complexity is essential if we want to learn from the past, navigate the challenges of the present.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the final chapters of World War I, I'm left with this sense of awe at the scale of the events, the courage and sacrifice of those who fought, and, just the profound impact it had on the world.
Yeah, and maybe even a touch of unease, right? Thinking about the missed opportunities, the decisions made, the paths not taken, the things that ultimately led to more conflict, more suffering.
But maybe the biggest takeaway from all this is that peace, it isn't just the absence of war. It's an ongoing process. It's this commitment to understanding, cooperation, resolving conflicts peacefully.
Absolutely. And that's a responsibility we all share.
Right.
Not just world leaders or diplomats, but every single person who wants a better future for themselves, for generations to come.
That's a powerful thought to end on. As we grapple with the challenges of our own time, it's, crucial to remember the lessons of the past, to work together to build a more just, more peaceful world.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, I really encourage you continue exploring this pivotal period in history. Keep asking questions, challenge your assumptions, dig deeper. The more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to shape the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll conclude this deep dive into the final chapters of World War I. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds curious.